tells me that we are live, and it says we are live. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a special broadcast of Creative on Purpose Live. I'm Scott Perry, your host, difference maker coach at Akimbo Workshops and Creative on Purpose. I'm here with a special edition of Creative on Purpose Live. Craft a story that connects, and that must mean that my friend Natalia Alvarez is here, and there she is right over there. Yes. And Natalia and I have brought on a very special guest to talk about all things story and storytelling, and she's right down there. That's Annette Simmons, author of many books.
The Story Factor.
The Story Factor. My favorite is The Story Factor. So what we're going to do is we're going to let Natalia and then Annette introduce themselves, and then we're going to start talking about story and storytelling and how you can craft a story that connects. So Natalia, take it away. Tell everybody who you are and what you're up to these days.
Natalia from The Story That Matters, and I apply storytelling to communication, helping people to move forward with a narrative and a story that create trust and people can believe in. And a long time admirer of the work of Annette Simmons. I'm really very happy to be talking to her today.
Well, thanks. My turn?
Your turn.
All righty. So I think what I'd like to say about me is I wrote The Story Factor back in 2000. So I've been doing this for a long time. My teachers were traditional folk tale tellers. And so that's my background. And then my business background is group process. So the first time I used story was I gathered true stories to prove that something was going on that everybody said wasn't going on. And that was territorial games. And so everybody say, oh, no, that's not happening here. And then if in private, they tell me a story and someone would just make your toenails curl. And so that made me fall in love with storytelling because we can prove stuff using stories.
Awesome. Well, and just in the interest of full disclosure, it was Natalia who introduced me to The Story Factor. I started with the audiobook because I love an audiobook. You can purchase The Story Factor on audiobook, and guess what? Annette Simmons herself will whisper The Story Factor in your ear, and after you're done, you're going to want to do what I did, which is buy the physical copy, because you need something that you can refer back to and mark up with your highlighter and your pen and a pencil. And it's a fabulous book. I want to draw some lessons from that book as we go along in that. And I know Natalia has questions for you too, but I thought it would be kind of fun to begin as I am wont to do, which is let's define our terms. What the heck is a story? What is storytelling? Natalia.
My definition,
Oh, no, go ahead, Annette.
Okay, my definition of story is a significant emotional experience. SEE, so people can see what you've seen. And so that significant emotional experience is going to go probably to some universal human experience, and that's where we all connect. So that's my definition of a story.
Yeah. I will go for something very similar, like a shared meaningful experience from one person to another. And that creates a connection, basically. And I think that's very important because sometimes, in our Western country and culture, we define the story in a certain way, and we forget that there are many cultures that they use storytelling in a different way. So what is meaningful from us is not maybe relevant for others. So how
in a way,
stories are, yeah,
in a way, there was a colonization of storytelling.
Yes.
And that started with Joseph Campbell, with the best of intentions, trying to understand what's the same about all these stories. What he did was he took one story that appeared a lot, and that idea of a hero vanquishing a dragon, if you will, those are the main characters usually in that kind of story, is always a story that's from a competitive narrative instead of a collaborative narrative. And when we go back to myth, we find these really complicated stories, and people complain, well, it's just so complicated. It's for a reason. It's complicated because we need story to explain complicated stuff, so that we can stop oversimplifying and actually come up with solutions.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I would define story along similar lines. I love that Natalia wove in connection, and I really resonate with significant and emotional. And I know that Natalia is very much about the emotional connection that comes through story. I think of story and storytelling as just the basic human impulse and narrative device that we use for sense making and wayfinding. And I think we're all kind of on the same page about what storytelling is, but I'm also interested in, like, why do we even care? What's
Well,
so important?
If I could add to storytelling, for me is evolutionary development that humans had to develop in order to survive as a collective. And so all these stories, their main goal is to get us on the same page or help us connect in some way. And, we start teaching kids how to behave when they're kids, with a story. Of course, we don't always practice that level of integrity ourselves and share when, all the time, but adults need those teaching stories as well in order to survive. Because if we don't have these stories that make sense, that my sacrifice in the short term is for our collective good in the long term, then nobody's going to make a sacrifice in the short term. And so I think that there's a survival aspect of the stories that have been passed down by our ancestors. They wanted to help us survive.
And also, I think the beautiful element of a story is you can put so many things on it. And the complexity of life can go into different characters that are not linear, but they are like life. And sometimes we feel this way, that we love somebody, but we feel that we're really very angry, and what to do with that. Because we just, as humans, we find it difficult to reconcile all these emotions. And when you hear a story of a character who goes through that and explains that and resolves that in a way or another, you feel like, there is transformation, there is possibility here.
I am not alone. That's what happens.
I am not alone.
It's just like, oh my God, that happened to me too. And those are that's what the stories we're looking for. Is it may not have specifically happened to them, but if you tell a universal story about a time you were forgiven, or a time when you screwed up, or a time when you shined, these are all universal experiences. And so people will, or tell a story about your mother, everybody goes straight to their mother.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I love that, because I agree that it's just it's a defining human characteristic, our ability to craft meaning from and to define. One of the things I say in both of my most recent handbooks is choose your story, choose your future. Story is how we make sense of who we are, how we make sense of our situation, how we make sense of the other person. And so we're always telling ourselves stories. And I'm telling myself a story about who I am, what's going on, who Natalia is, who Annette is, and I'm telling myself a story about the story that I think that Annette and Natalia are telling themselves about me.
Exactly.
So there's this just complete chaos.
And the beauty of pointing that out, Scott, is that means that maybe it's not that you can't find the right story. Maybe you need to revisit the story you're telling yourself about your audience. I find that 50% of the time, the executives that I'm training for telling storytelling have a not very complimentary, sort of story they're telling themselves about their audience. And it shows through in the story they're thinking that they should tell. And if I can get them to realize that, these are humans too, and often they'll be vulnerable, which is a great demonstration of trust. And that's one of the cool things about telling a story that shares some of who you are on the inside, is that you're going first in that dance of trust.
Well, I love that you brought that up, because I would like to unpack that a little bit more, Annette. So you've woven in vulnerability and trust, and alluded to the importance of empathy in storytelling. And these are, again, if we're talking about defining human characteristics, of which story is a manifestation, what is the, what's the role of empathy, trust, and vulnerability, and how can we begin to practice that a little bit more intentionally so that we can tell better stories that help make a bigger difference?
Well, without talking about in the hypothetical, I always like specific stuff. And if you feel like your story's boring, then you're not telling enough truth. And so I tell the story, this actually happened to me, which is this retired minister was writing the history of our church. I shouldn't, of a church. And anyway, he said, it's just really boring. And I said, well, then you're not telling the truth. And I step into places I never know what I'm stepping into. And he says, well, you mean about when I had the affair with that S&M practicing female minister in the other town? I went, well, it's already more interesting to me. but I was like, my. Anyway, tell that story because hopefully it'll get you to remember that, if your story is boring to you, it's going to be boring to them. And there's something you're not telling. And whatever it is that you're most afraid to put in there, that's going to be the thing that causes people to really feel connected with you because you went first. You decided to show your vulnerability, and they will respond in kind, ideally, or not.
But you, Natalia, the role of vulnerability, trust, and empathy.
Yes, I always think about the word unmasking, unveiling, and how stories drop the veil in a way and allow the transformation and to put yourself in another place, which is not so egoistic because you allow yourself to say, well, that's my truth. And I'm able to share it with you. So what is yours? So then talking about the subject that Annette, I know she's very interested now about competition and collaboration. Mm-hmm. It's not that I want to look better or I want to be better than you. Is that, well, I am here in the same place as you are. So I allow you to see me. So what can we do together? And that's a totally different proposition that take me out, I'm going to make a joke. No, it's a totally different approach to communication and more generous and about connection for me.
Yeah, when I teach who I am, so I always start people with the who I am, why I'm here story. And if you tell a story about how, I joined this law firm and I did so well, I got 50 clients and I stole them all to start my own law firm. Well, that tells me who you are, but that doesn't necessarily build trust. And so a lot of people are confusing these achievement stories as stories that would build trust. And that's actually, there are some, but really an I blew it story is going to be more valuable in creating trust.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I'm curious about is one of the assertions that I make is empathy is one of those things that we all pay a lot of lip service to. We all think that we're pretty good at empathy. Like, the ability to see, hear, and understand someone else's situation, feelings, beliefs, and so forth. And what I find is that although I think that I'm great at empathy, practicing it towards other people, I find myself, catch myself in conversation with myself that reveal that I'm not very good at practicing empathy on myself. And I'm guessing that if I were to crawl into somebody else's head, I would find the same about them. What do you think what's the value and importance of doing the internal empathy work, vulnerability work, and trust work before you can do that with others through storytelling?
Well, it's the reason I start with the who I am, why I'm here story, because I want people to self-examine. And I know from experience that 99% of the time when I ask somebody who they are and why they're here, they're not going to tell a story. I'm here to exploit everybody. And so it reorients them into their collaborative, natural, moral. And one of the things I say, just give a story about integrity. because it means different things in different situations. Sometimes it means shutting up. Sometimes it means speaking up. And if it hasn't cost you time or money recently, are you sure you still have it? And so I intentionally get people zeroing in on what values I would want in somebody I would trust, and how do I have those values. So, and it's not always going to be the first story they come up with when you have the templates that's, a character and a choice and a beginning, middle, end, that sort of stuff. It's not always that first story. So I think coming up with the why, who I am, why I'm here story first puts them in the right space, the headspace.
Yeah, I do agree. I like starting with questions such as, tell me about a meaningful moment in your life that changed something for you. And guess what? Nobody said when I have this job interview and when I make my first million. People come to something which is like my first son was born, or, things that we could all relate to, and that set up the tone. And sometimes if somebody is saying something more professional orientated in the sense of a goal that is more materialistic, and I start listening to the others, you can feel that person wants to add something more. And it's amazing. And if always when you ask that question, people don't go for what we could possibly put into a performance chart in any organization.
Right.
Well, and so it sounds to me that like the story of who I am and why I'm here has a lot to do with vision and values. These are my core beliefs, ethics. This is my integrity, and then here's my intention. Here's where I am going.
A lot of the stuff that I design is designed based on the trouble I know people have coming up with stories. Okay. So I could say vision and value comes first, but that's the hardest story to get anybody to come up with. When I started with the who I am, why I'm here story, usually that'll flow really, really fast. And then I talk about, okay, so there's also value and action stories. So I kind of expand out to basically you're giving, you're role modeling by example with actually just by narrating it. So your value in action lets other people know what your interpretation of integrity is. And I know what you're thinking stories are the ones where, I know they're going to hate this. So let me just say, I want everybody to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. No, I'm just kidding. Whatever you have to do to get them over that hump. And then the last one I come to is the vision. But that's just me. What about you?
Go ahead, Natalia.
Yeah, I have the same. I always start with meaningful values, and I let them work a little bit what they come next. But these two possibly, and the why always come first.
Yeah.
And then let them explore a little bit what are the stories that they really want to tell. Because what is happening is that when you start without the stories, the energy in the room change. Because they are allowing themselves to see themselves differently. So they might be things that they have not been talking before and they want to talk right now, or stories that might not fit exactly. So it is interesting what is happening when you just open up something in like tell me a story, and everybody accept it, and nobody say, oh, this is terrible, I'm going to leave the room. That's rubbish.
I'll let you know that somebody's going to say, oh, this is terrible, I'm going to leave the room, in their head. In most corporate situations. And what we do is we start on the other side of the room, because by the time it gets to them, they're like, oh, I've got a story that's really meaningful. Well, not, you know what I mean.
In the workshop that Natalia and I put together recently, we found that starting with the values point was a great way to connect with the audience. That when we can connect around common values, beliefs, that's a way to bring the audience in. And I've been thinking a little bit more about how most of my clients are what I call difference makers. They're people that are trying to live their legacy and make a difference, a bigger difference right now, as opposed to thinking about how they can leave behind money and monuments. So starting with their values, leveraging their talents, and then interacting with an audience that shares their values and needs their talents to help them solve a problem, head into a common possibility. That those are that those are the kind of things that work. But the piece that I'm really interested in is that the piece that I struggle the most with, which is, and maybe it's just a man thing, not to bring up gender, Annette.
Oh no, I would never go there.
But the vulnerability piece can be really, really hard, because as a storyteller, we want to come across as the hero, as the expert, when actually the hero is really, it's not us. And being the expert and being kind of bulletproof is not really a great way to endear ourselves as storytellers with our audience.
Well, I absolutely agree. The deal is that these competitive narratives where you're 10 times that 10x whatever thing that everybody's putting on the front of everything, and these wild claims are clickbait, and so people think, well, look at the numbers of clicks I got. But if you've overpromised, and then when somebody comes to look at your article or whatever and under-delivered, you're actually causing, more problems. And I have always believed in substance. I believe in building substance, like this next book that I'm working on. I've worked on for 20 years. If it's a good enough book, I think image will take care of itself. And so, and I think people trying to be something they're not aren't really doing themselves any good anyway. Your best asset is that you're uniquely you, and nobody else can do that. So when you talk about the meaningful moment, Natalia, I ask them to come up the qualities that they bring to the room that wouldn't be there if they weren't there. And then tell a story about that quality in action. So it's the same thing, all of these things, but it's not, a template of and this happened, but that happened. Therefore, all those things can fit when you go backwards, but they don't necessarily help you go forwards.
I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about, with an example of collaborative and competitive narratives, because I know that you are writing and working on that. Yeah. And I find it very, very interesting and important at this moment. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
I'd love to. I'm obsessed right now. So all my training came from folk tellers, and that's a particular kind of story. And then when I wrote The Story Factor, I'm like, you guys come use this stuff. It's a great way to connect. It's a great way to think. And unfortunately, what happened is that about 10 years in, the only tactics that were being delivered for storytelling were part of a competitive narrative, which is this is how to win and not lose. And the stories that I've learned, like Cassandra, the myth of Cassandra, are stories that show that not only that you had a choice, but sometimes you don't have a choice. And how do we deal with this unresolvable paradox? So the Cassandra story in a competitive narrative is just the part where the Trojans were under siege. The Greeks pretended like they won and they were going to give them a gift, the Trojan horse. Cassandra had been told that she had been blessed with the gift of prophecy and then cursed that nobody would believe her. So in that thing, it makes us look powerless because Cassandra could predict the future, and she was cursed. But if you go back further in that myth, way back when the gods and goddesses were having a party and decided not to invite Eris, the goddess of discord, what you find out is that Eris decided to crash the party anyway with a golden apple that said "for the fairest," that created a cat fight between the goddesses that then was solved by, guess who? Cassandra's brother, who won in that story the hand of Helen. And that's when the Trojan War could have been stopped. And so one of the things I love about collaborative narratives is that they hold a bigger part of the story, not pretending like there's a win-lose, like there's a soldier, you can slay a dragon, but understanding the complexity of the whole thing so that we use these stories to learn things like delayed gratification, all those things that help us survive, and the competitive narratives are undermining every day.
Do you think, I was wondering if competitive narrative make not just linear stories, but simplistic stories in a way, like if you do this, you will win that. Whereas in collaborative narrative, it is different.
Well, in a competitive narrative, there's a winner and a loser. In a collaborative narrative, we all win. I mean, it completely changes the priorities. And so I use an example of the mycorrhizae, the network underneath the forest, that fungal network. And that's a collaborative narrative that nature invented. And so if you start to think about how that narrative reads in terms of the logic of the trees, what their priorities are for the mother trees to send sugars out to the young trees, not to charge interest for it. And there's no single tree that could possibly, want to be the last tree standing. It's just not in their best interest. And so the collaborative narratives change what it is that we need to do next.
I was wondering about, so you brought up the Trojan War, and and Natalia was asking about, or talking about linear narrative, and Homer employs the trick of in media res in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. He begins the narrative in the middle of the action, as opposed to the once upon a time and then and they all lived happily ever after. What's your read on how we can about using that device, but other devices that we can use to make our stories more engaging in a time when people's attention is a lot of distraction?
Well, I think that's a function of making our stories more accurate, is to start in the middle. If you ever read the Bhagavad Gita, that's all over the place. And so a lot of our myths from many of the cultures are all over the place because life is all over the place, because you're balancing 6 different things, not just 2. And every win is not necessarily going to help you survive. It could, they're like the Trojan horse. You get your hubris involved in a win, and you burn a bridge. And then next time when you need some help, they're like, you're on your own, buddy. So the beauty of these nonlinear stories is that it says it's both good to win and to lose. And our job is to figure out how to balance when we decide, okay, me first, and when we decide everybody else first. And if we're not toggling back and forth between those two, then everything's left to a competitive narrative. And you end up with very few winners, way too many losers. And that's the point at which the plot changes for everybody.
Yeah, well, we could certainly be telling ourselves some better stories that would promote our health and well-being as a species right about now, which speaks to I'm just wondering what you see, Annette, in your work around, your clients are hiring you because what they are doing is not working, and oftentimes, businesses, products, services, they're really trying to win the battle around features and benefits, as opposed to what really matters to their prospects and customers, which is the transformation on offer or the emotional connection.
To be honest, I stepped back for a couple of years because I know it'll become clear the diminishing returns on competitive narratives. It's not long. And lots of people are starting to become aware now. And so I felt like people needed to get to reach that conclusion on their own. And they're beginning to, I get more phone calls now. But for a while there, I was like, if this is what you think I'm supposed to teach you about storytelling, I'm out.
So what about storytelling and agenda and trying to engineer a result? How do we help people? One of the things that I remember from the story factor is you kind of suggest several times along the way, like, I assume that you are a force for good in this world. I assume that your intentions are pure. But we have seen very, very recently, and see every day, people employing the tools of storytelling to, for nefarious and harmful.
The pandemic was a perfect example, because when you turn that into a competitive narrative, then you pretend like one party saying we're in trouble and the other party saying we're not, and accusing each other of a ruse, and it guarantees that we're not taking care of the whole. The story I use, King Solomon, the two women are fighting over a baby, and King Solomon's like, well, we can cut it in half. And that's what they're doing right now, is they're cutting it in half. And we've got to build the awareness of these collaborative narratives, so that looks as stupid as it is. I really don't know any other way other than storytelling to shift the narrative. And so this book that I spent 20 years writing was because I wasn't having any success convincing anyone to drop the competitive narratives. And so this is a systematic illustration of how the competitive narratives undermine, specifically with women will tend to make more predictions of harm, and we will be more harm averse. And so those people who say loss aversion is a cognitive error, the evolutionary lesson is that when you have enough, you don't need more. And if we're imposing these linear framed, supposedly this is what rational people do, this cognitive bias that's been defined as loss aversion makes it look like that's a mistake, when in at least 50% of the cases, these people don't need any more. And diminishing their resistance to loss is not going to help them at all. It's just going to make them borrow money they don't need and that sort of thing.
Interesting. What do you got, Natalia?
No, I was just listening. Don't know what else to add, Annette. I mean, to such an insightful way of describing. I mean, one of the things I think about competitive narratives is that they are based on illusion of control. So
Bingo.
If I do something, I get something.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have lived long enough, you know that that's not the case.
Yeah.
And when they sell me something like most of these narratives are based on that. And I find that that's very damaging.
Yeah, the theory of power has been that power is neutral. It's neither good nor bad. And that's a competitive narrative because it depends on which side you're on, right? But for collaborative narratives, there is a form of bad power, and that is the kind of power that dominates and coerces. And a lot of the people who hold collaborative narratives is the power to protect and nurture.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am coming to the conclusion that there is bad power, and that is that dominate and coerce, and that's very built into the competitive narratives.
That's reminds, I mean, we've been living in a time for some time, it seems, that where we reward certainty and overconfidence over things for which there is absolutely no certainty or confidence. I mean, the pandemic, as you just pointed to, is an example. Like, we all expected tomorrow to be another day just like today, because today was just like yesterday. And then one day we all woke up globally and found ourselves, in a situation where there is nothing but uncertainty. And what I'm hearing in your urge to have us consider the collaborative narrative is, how do we confront how do we re-engage our curiosity and consideration, our sense of wonder?
I think there's security to be found in the idea of paradox, the idea that, well, I have to take care of myself and I have to take care of others. And so what we're doing is we're creating a comfort with the toggle back and forth that's more comfortable than the two fighting, and makes more sense just, on the face of it. You can just feel that it's smarter to decrease fossil fuel use right now. I mean, we don't really need the statistics anymore. We're real clear about that. And it's us narrating the both and stories that build people's sense of confidence that it is both and. It's sometimes you take care of you, sometimes we take care of the collective.
And the other thing I wanted to hear from you, Annette, is, for me, one sort of red signal is when I start hearing stories based on fear and character, and building this otherness, me and the other, you know, that's where I'm starting to think it's quite dangerous. I remember I read a long time ago that, we tend to think that human rights was a movement that was an intellectual movement, but it was partly based in Europe, at least, when romance novels start to spread around Europe, and people start to feel that they could fall in love, as the neighbor. So they start empathy start to be something. And when empathy was something that started to spread around, then the intellect was ready to start talking about, human rights and citizenship that is starting in France with the French Revolution, but everything. But so this idea of fear and the other, as when a story is trying to put that emphasis on these elements, for me, that's danger.
And that's why conspiracy theories are so dangerous. What they've learned is what we know as storytellers. If you make something visceral, smell, taste, touch, anything that stimulates the imagination, it sticks faster. So all they're doing is coming up with blame stories that are so salacious that people get off them. I think they get titillated by the stories about pedophilia and all that. That's conspiracy theories. So it's a combination of blame and titillation, which is designed to keep you off the hard work that we must engage in if we're going to come up with solutions. And so it's about how we narrate these collaborative values. And for me, it's also about having faith that in your own story, in your own take on things. If you think that, doing all this competitive stuff is draining you of meaning, then emotions, we have them for a reason, for an evolutionary reason, and what feels meaningful is actually what's going to help us survive. And trust feels good.
Yes, it does, isn't it?
Well, and that kind of brings us back to where we began, which is, we're not going to win the battle of storytelling by continuing to engage in competitive narrative. I'm right, you're wrong, and here's all the logical reasons why. But where we begin, I think that change happens not because one person gets inside a bad system and makes it better, but somebody builds a system right alongside the existing paradigm that is so undeniably better that sooner or later everybody just says the ship we're on is BS. We're gonna hop over here. And I'm wondering if the answer doesn't go back to, because I think basing stories on differences is very simplistic, but the simpler solution is, where do we begin? Where are the common values? And trust that Natalia was just pointing to could be a starting point. But I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about, like, how do we begin, or where do we begin in terms of the common threads, the common beliefs, the common vision?
Well, my goal with this book is one, to point out that using power in order to survive as a collective changes the agenda. Okay, just look, we're going to be coming up with different conclusions at our budget meetings by necessity. So expect that, So to be prepared for the discomfort, I think, is one of the ways that you help people move through the discomfort. The other aspect is giving them the experience of how meaningful it feels when you tell stories about collaboration and trust, and how certainty is isolating. But embracing ambiguity is when you're staying in relation, and that means that you're coming up with solutions that you couldn't come up with by yourself. So making that feel more safe than putting your dukes up and creating silos is, and I think that people, I think human behavior is starting to show a backlash against all of this competitive reasoning. Now, the authoritarians, dominance is job number one. And so there will be times that we have to defend collaborative narratives. But in general, I think it's our job to tell and to get people telling each other, which is Natalia is talking about. The first story you tell is something meaningful. Or the first story you tell is, what I offered to this group. And it feels good, it feels right, and it feels smart. And for me, we have to talk to people through their physiology so that they can start experiencing that this is possible, and that this way of life, our ancestors saw what was, what could go wrong. They named what could go wrong. They gave us lessons about what to do about it. And so we need to start using story reasoning at least as much as we use these numerical criteria.
I was thinking, Annette, that I know a bit about what you're writing, and that we don't arrive to collaboration with rational thinking. Trust and collaboration is emotional. So it's when we start telling the stories and we share that space and we put our defenses down, we are building bridges that enable that collaboration. And too much rationality, too much statistics, it just brings up defenses and call necessarily for competitive narratives. So there will be times in which I'm not saying, I mean, as a woman, irrational woman, just be irrational and emotional. We're not talking about that, but we're talking about the possibility to go from one place to another and combine them, and to be ready to say, well, this situation requires from me this thinking, that situation requires from me that the
and
other.
My whole thing is that competitive narratives have hogged the term rational thinking for far too long. Collaborative narratives, there are lots of rational reasons why, you know what I mean? But it's just, it's been discredited for so long. We've got a job to do to reclaim it.
What the idea that's popping in my head is, human beings began employing narrative and storytelling when their existence was in jeopardy, when we were not the fastest, nor the biggest, nor the strongest thing on the planet, and most everything else was bigger, stronger, faster, and wanted to eat us. We created narrative and language so that we could get together and face the unknown and lean into the uncertain, and
capture wisdom.
Well, and that journey itself was worth it. It wasn't about, we didn't set out to conquer the planet. It just so happened that along the way, that sort of happened until this virus came around, and something so small we can't even see it decided, actually, you're not really as big and strong and as you think you are. So I'm just wondering about, just as we're beginning to wrap up here, this idea of narrative and storytelling and telling stories about collaborating together in pursuit of leaning into uncertainty, but also stepping into possibility is, a way forward and a way out of this competitive narrative where we can embrace the process, trust the process, which will enable us to trust ourselves, which will allow us to come up with better processes, as opposed to the certainty and overconfidence that we've been talking about in the competitive narrative.
Yeah, I think our business decision-making processes have changed radically over the last 20 years, and the rush to automate. A lot of the things that have been automated are automated with a competitive bias. Win, lose, putting employees in competition with each other. And so when we decide to use story reasoning, then that means that we need to share the stories. We need to understand the stories. There isn't a corporation out there that if they didn't go to their, first response staff, wouldn't find out some incredible stories that show the value of collaboration. And they could learn from those stories, and the rest of the company can learn from those stories. And so we're just looking at what it is we point people's eyes to, what it is that we point their attention to. And my experience is that once you get them to have the experience of sharing stories, all of a sudden they know it's not just win-lose.
Love it. Well, so ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wrap up this broadcast. Annette Simmons is the author of The Story Factor. And is your new book have a decided upon title?
Right now, what I'm calling the new book is Drinking from a Different Well: How Women's Stories Change What Power Means in Action.
And that one is forthcoming.
Yeah, they're October.
In October, and I think that you'll be back on the show to talk about that book when it's actually out in the world. So we're excited about that. You can learn more about Annette Simmons at AnnetteSimmons.com. And of course, Natalia, my friend and collaborator, can be found at thestorythatmatters.com. And of course, it is always fantastic to see you at creativeonpurpose.com. Ladies, thank you so much for a rich conversation about storytelling and the importance of narrative. And I'm going to stop being so competitive and try to be a little bit more collaborative. Thanks to you all. Take care.
You've already got that covered. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.